All right, hello, and welcome to Unit 3, Area Study 3, Australia and the World Economy for 2023 and beyond in the new study design. An upside about this topic in the new study design is it is very similar to what it was before. There are a few little tweaks here and there, but it's essentially the same, so all previous resources are still going to be relevant. If you, for some reason, want to go back, the videos that I recorded for these 3 or 4 years ago, 100% still okay. The fast recap still okay, as it will cover everything that you need to know on this topic. But when we look at this topic, Australia and the world economy is all about how money, goods and services, human capital flow between nations. So what we send to other countries and what other countries send to us, and how that impacts the domestic macroeconomic goals and living standards overall. So the key knowledge that we're going to look at today is all about the gains from international trade. So the fact that we get lower prices, greater choice, access to resources, economies of scale, and increased competition and efficiency, that is what we're going to be looking at. So the impacts of trade on living standards and on Australia in general. So our learning intention for this topic is to understand how global transactions impact on living standards in Australia. And our success criteria is that you can explain multiple ways that international transactions impact Australia, and you can describe what international transactions are. So to get straight into them, how international transactions for goods and services impact our living standards. So international transactions are a massive part of all of our lives in 2023. So for Australia, these impact economic growth, unemployment, and living standards because imports, exports, and foreign investment make up about 20% of aggregate demand. Significantly over the last few years through COVID and in the recovery from COVID, although COVID is still very much a real thing, our exports have really propped Australia up through what should be a global recession that is occurring during COVID and beyond. And because of our commodities exports and the fact that they are relatively inelastic in demand, we have had really strong export growth, and therefore it has bolstered our aggregate demand, economic growth, and therefore kept unemployment low and kept incomes relatively high comparatively. So international transactions can really affect that. So one of the reasons why our exports have been so strong is because China was demanding our iron ore exports and a lot of our commodities exports significantly. And because they needed those exports, that drove economic growth in Australia and kept unemployment low. Imports, on the other hand, are really affected by the value of the Australian dollar. We import a lot from overseas because although we do have a lot of resources, we do not have a lot of finished goods and services by comparison because we have really high labor costs in Australia, and therefore we're more likely to import a lot of things that are made more cheaply overseas. So all of these things can affect efficiency, resource allocation, and living standards. So trade liberalization, which we'll get into in the 5th lesson of this topic, is all about the removal of trade barriers between nations. So the reduction of tariffs and more free trade agreements have meant that Australian businesses have been able to allocate their resources more efficiently to compete internationally. So one of the main things that comes up in this topic is the importance of competitive advantages and the economies of scale. So a competitive advantage is a condition or circumstance that puts a company or business in a favorable or superior business position. So essentially what you can do better than other parts of the world, like what is going to give you an edge that sets you apart from businesses in other parts of the world. Then we've got economies of scale, which is a proportionate savings in costs gained by an increased level of production. So essentially all businesses have a certain amount of fixed costs. The accounting students will be groaning when they hear this, but you have a certain amount of fixed costs. And as you produce more and more, those fixed costs become a smaller proportion of your overall costs. So you may have to pay $1,000 in rent every month. For every item you produce more, that rent becomes a smaller proportion of your overall costs for rent. And therefore you are achieving economies of scale by producing at a much larger scale. International transactions can also impact the inflation rate and living standards. So we're seeing this at the moment potentially through the drive in demand for exports, driving up our aggregate demand. This can cause demand inflation to rise, especially if there's a drop in the value of the Australian dollar. If the Australian dollar drops in value, it means our exports get cheaper, and therefore there is going to be significantly more demand for them. And that can actually lead to demand inflation if demand is not keeping up with supply. Cost inflation may rise if there's a drop in the value of the Australian dollar as well, for businesses who use imports as factors of production. And that's really important in Australia because we have a lot of businesses who use imports as part of their production, because a lot of the time we can get cheaper factors of production from overseas, and that can lower cost of production and increase our aggregate supply. But if the Australian dollar drops in value, suddenly those imported inputs become more expensive, and businesses will pass that on through higher prices, therefore causing cost inflation. This can also affect income distribution and living standards. So rising exports can mean that business owners in export industries have a greater share of national income compared to other sectors. And in any of these cases, if exports are booming, it's essentially the people who control commodities, so like the Gina Rineharts of the world, that benefit the most. And the average worker continues to earn their regular income. So then getting into some other types of international transactions that occur. So a really important one that you'll look at a lot more in Unit 4, Area Study 2, is human capital flows. So greater level of trade agreements has increased the freedom for people to work in other countries, which is referred to as the movement of human capital. And this is really important in Australia at the moment, because in Australia we have historic low rates of unemployment with 3.4% unemployment in November of 2022. And we are struggling to fill jobs because there's not a lot of people left to fill them. So one of the ways we're trying to fix this is by increasing spaces for migration in Australia by 35,000 to 195,000 to help alleviate these skill shortages and bring in skilled labour from other parts of the world to help improve our productive capacity and therefore produce at a greater rate. And those people would bring in and create demand in Australia. We have financial capital flows. So we've got investment spending which comes into or out of Australia. Normally in, as we have a relatively low savings rate in Australia, which means that we have a lot more debt than we have savings in our accounts, and therefore we're usually reliant on foreign investors investing in businesses in Australia to increase our capacity. And in some cases, the capital flows involve the buying and selling of shares in businesses within another country. So we might be buying the shares in businesses overseas, or overseas investors may be buying shares in Australian businesses. And then lastly, we also have the international transfer of foreign aid to poorer countries. We give a lot of foreign aid to other countries. We don't receive a lot of foreign aid, despite the amount of natural disasters we've been going through in recent times. But the general idea is that we give foreign aid to other countries and hoping that when they are back on their feet, they are going to be able to benefit Australia in the future. Even though it is a one-way transaction with no expectation of any benefit in return, which we'll get into specifically in the balance of payments next lesson, it's given no strings attached, but there are slight strings attached when we're expecting some kind of gain from it in the future, hopefully. And that's it for lesson 1, all about international transactions, how they impact living standards, how they impact Australia overall. If you have any questions at all about this first set of content, shoot me a comment below or email me, sean@therunningeconomy.com. Next lesson, we're going to be looking at the balance of payments, which is one of the largest and trickiest parts of this topic other than the terms of trade. And then we'll be moving on to various other parts of this 5-lesson topic for Area Study 3, which is now worth 25% of your Unit 3 score. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.